CMC's political season forums, of which today is one, are sponsored by the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation, represented by Adam Sharp and his associates, Hannah News Service, represented by Stephen Marks and his associates, and the Jeffrey Company, and I believe I saw Tad Jeffrey and Jim Garland enter the room. Thank you for your sponsorship. Thank all of you for sponsoring. A complete biography for each speaker in today's forum program, so I'll provide only a brief introduction. Our first two speakers are representing the yes side of issue 2, the director of the Money in Politics Project of Ohio Citizens Action, and representing Voters First. Please welcome Catherine Turcer. A former U.S. Congressman for Ohio's 18th District and currently principal at Voorhees Advisors. Please welcome Zack Space. For the flip side, our next two speakers are representing the no side of issue 2, a public affairs focused communications specialist with experience in both government and agency positions. Please welcome Jenny Camper. A former Ohio State Senator and former member of the Ohio House of Representatives and currently with Strategic Insight Group. Please welcome Jeff Jacobson. And serving as our moderator today from the State House News Bureau, Karen Kassler. On behalf of the Farm Bureau, the Jeffrey Company, Hannah News Service, and CMC, welcome to all our panelists. Karen, it's all yours. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm glad to be back here in Columbus, and I'm glad to be in a smaller and hopefully a little bit quieter crowd. I was at the City Club of Cleveland on Monday for the debate between Josh Mandel and Sherrod Brown. It was interesting. And I've decided if I'm going to moderate anything else from now on, I need an air horn. So, and I'm sure you, if you've been watching the presidential, vice presidential debates, you would think that an air horn might be kind of useful too. But I want to get right into this, and I want to first of all go over a couple of rules here. We have a change in policy on how we're doing the questions, because obviously you're invited to ask questions. The procedure is that if you have a question for any of our panelists, you'll use the blank paper that'll be coming to your table to write it down with your name, and then you'll give it to someone who will be circulating around the room to collect the questions. And members of the program committee will then select the questions, and you will be invited to the microphone to ask your question beginning the usual time around 1 o'clock. We just want to have a chance for both sides to get equal time with questions and have them looked over a little bit. Now, what we're going to do here is we have 3 minutes of opening arguments from either side, and either side is going to be speaking both of you or just one of you. 3 minutes total, and then I've got a few questions for you both, and then it'll be over to you folks. So let's go ahead and start with the pro side here, the pro issue 2 side, and who's going to be speaking? All right, go ahead, Congressman.
Thank you, Karen, and I'd like to thank the Metropolitan Club and the sponsors for encouraging this, what I hope to be a constructive debate about an issue that I firmly believe may be the most important issue on our ballot in November. In a moment, Catherine will speak to the structure of the amendment, but before she does, I wanted to provide my perspective really on the context of the political situation that we find ourselves in. And it's hard to argue that we have not become over-polarized, particularly in Washington, D.C., and that this polarization has created stagnation and dysfunctionality. The redistricting process that we use in Ohio and that most states around the country use is a primary contributor to this polarization and thus the stagnation and dysfunctionality. And this is at a time where we've got some very compelling issues that we need to deal with as a nation, and this situation is making it impossible to deal with them. The practical effect of the polarization that exists right now in this country and the redistricting process we have is that most congressional districts, anyway, are non-competitive. That means that you can predict the outcome as to which party is going to win long before November comes around. And the practical effect of that is that if you're a Republican in a Republican-leaning district or a Democrat in a Democrat-leaning district, the only political jeopardy you have as a politician in order to keep your job is if someone gets you from your right if you're a Republican or left if you're a Democrat in a primary. That is a serious problem because it forces members of Congress in most congressional districts to gravitate toward the extremes. Now, issue 2 is not perfect. You're never going to come up with language that satisfies everyone, but the imperfections of this amendment, I think, are grossly outweighed by the need that this country has to create a wall between partisanism and districting, and issue 2 represents that opportunity. Now I'm going to introduce Catherine, who will talk briefly about the structure before we commence the debate.
And you have about a minute.
Sounds good. So I just like to highlight that the manipulation of those district lines is in fact the manipulation of your vote. Now, you know, we don't have any visuals up here, but just imagine this. We have a district that works its way all the way from Toledo, all the way over to Cleveland. You know, just think about that snake along the lake. And then I want you also to imagine the other crazy districts, the one that looks like a duck, which is the Congressional District 4, that works its way from suburban Cleveland almost over to the Indiana border. And, you know, pretty as pretty does, but the manipulations of those district lines actually gets at exactly what Zack was talking about, which is it creates these safe seats. Safe seats more for Republicans, but safe seats for Republicans, safe seats for Democrats. And what's important is it doesn't matter which party does this. Both have done it in the past. They're likely to do it in the future. And a vote for yes on issue 2 is about, hey, let's just take it out of their hands and put it in the hands of a citizens commission.
All right, now let's turn over to the anti-vote no issue side. And are you both speaking, or?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. Go ahead.
All right. Well, good afternoon, and thank you again to the Metropolitan Club and the sponsors, and Catherine and Congressman Space and Karen for the opportunity to discuss issue 2. Quite simply, issue 2 is the wrong approach to redistricting in Ohio. We agree redistricting can be improved, but issue 2 is not the vehicle to take us there. A number of newspapers, including the Plain Dealer, the Akron Beacon Journal, the Columbus Dispatch, the Canton Repository, and statewide associations, including the Ohio Farm Bureau, the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, and chamber groups in Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland, with a history of supporting bipartisan issues, all oppose issue 2. Opponents to issue 2 have carefully considered this amendment to our Constitution, and they have concluded it's full of flaws. Of particular concern is that the amendment requires the Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court, and more precisely appellate court judges, to play a key role in selecting the initial 42 candidates for the 12-member commission. Involving an impartial judiciary into this most highly charged of political processes got the attention of the nonpartisan Ohio State Bar Association and Ohio Judicial Conference. Both organizations oppose issue 2. They say the involvement is a misuse of the judiciary and compromises the separation of powers between the legislative and judicial branches. Along these lines, consider the notion of keeping politics out of redistricting. The proponents of issue 2 have said it's their goal through this amendment to remove politics from the redistricting system. On a few fronts, that won't happen. Senator Jacobson.
Thank you. The issue with Ohio's reapportionment process is that complete control rests with one side. Every 10 years, starting in 1971, no matter who's in charge, Democrat or Republican, the other side gets steamrolled. There's a simple solution. Make both parties have to agree on the map. That's the centerpiece of what a bipartisan group of legislators proposed earlier this year. 2 years ago, in fact, the Senate passed such a proposal, but the House Democratic leadership balked because they wrongly believed that their party would control the process after the last gubernatorial election. Here we are 2 years later, and issue 2, ironically, makes that same gamble. When they copied the California amendment, which was also called Voters First, they actually removed California's requirement that a majority of both parties' commissioners, as well as a majority of the independents, would have to approve the plan. That leaves the Ohio plan open to one-party domination, and both parties will do everything they can to game it. The stakes are too high. One example, both party chairmen will give a list to their judges of who should be picked and who should not be picked for the commission. California also requires its commission to adopt a conflict of interest policy for employees. The Ohio plan doesn't. So you may have heard them say that political contributors and political party involved people can't be a member. Well, they can work for the commission. Reform is needed, but we should not gamble Ohio's future on a plan that pretends it's above partisanship while still allowing one side to steamroll the other. Thank you.
All right. Now that we've heard opening statements, I do want to read a little bit. I was going to read the whole ballot language, but it's a little long. So let's just go over a couple of the basics. Right now, the legislature draws the congressional maps, and then a 5-member apportionment board draws the state house districts maps. The Issue 2 amendment would actually put both of those map drawing processes. The authority would then go from lawmakers into the hands of a 12-member citizens commission, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, 4 unaffiliated. Those people who want to be members of the commission would apply to a panel of appeals court judges. The judges would come up with a selection procedure to pick the candidates who, and this is a quote, have the relevant skills and abilities, including a capacity for impartiality, and who reflect the diversity of Ohio. The judges use that process to bring it down to 42 applicants. That group will then be winnowed down by the House Speaker and the House Minority Leader to no fewer than 24. Then 9 members' names will be drawn in a lottery in public by the judges. The 9 members will then pick the 3 other members. And then the commission will have to, and again, this is a quote, and forgive me if I stumble over these words, but there are a lot of them. It will adopt a plan that complies with all applicable federal and state constitutional provisions, federal statutory provisions, and the contiguity requirement, and that most closely meets the factors of community preservation, competitiveness, representational fairness, and compactness. That's a lot. So I want to turn my first question over to the vote yes side. Your tagline is people, not politicians. But politicians and lobbyists are people, and in many cases they are the people who have the most knowledge of how to draw a map, since there are very specific rules on how to do this, and there's still a debate on who can apply. You want to keep politicians out, but local politicians would be able to apply. So can you explain a little bit about how politicians, people not politicians, really works here?
Sure. I'm assuming you're going to let me take this. So anyway, the way that we looked at this, and we spent a long time thinking about the problem and talking about the problem, and I go back to thinking about the first time the League of Women Voters approached me, which was in the late 90s, to talk about redistricting reform, and they had been at this for much longer before that. But the biggest problem, as we think about this, is that those folks that draw the district lines have such a conflict of interest. How can they draw those lines and not think about their political futures? How can they draw those district lines and not think about their party? It's just incredibly difficult to ask either party, individuals, to actually do this. And we don't expect angels, but we do say when you have a conflict of interest, you should recuse yourself. And that means that these district lines should be drawn by an independent citizens commission. Now, we said to ourselves, okay, saying, hey, we want to keep out the folks that have a conflict of interest. And that's why we say, okay, we don't want federal candidates, we don't want federal officials, we don't want state elected folks, those people that have a direct conflict of interest. And that's why we narrowed it down. But of course, if you are a member of the school board, it doesn't make sense to isolate absolutely everybody, just those folks that have a conflict of interest. Because we know that 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, 4 independents, or in some cases, I think none of the above, they could be another party, that those folks are going to be able to really focus on the good of the voter and compactness and competitiveness without thinking about their political futures.
So I want to give you folks a chance to respond to that. You have about a minute and a half, given how long Catherine took there.
Thank you. One thing I'd start out by saying is this amendment permits a lot of people who are very involved in politics to participate. If you are a local official, you can be a part of this commission. Imagine, for example, if Mayor Coleman decides he wants to be on the commission and he gets picked. He would have a lot of deference from others because he is seen as a leader, but on the other hand, he's a very partisan Democrat. This doesn't isolate people from politics. It excludes a group of politicians while allowing in thousands of others. But it also is unfair in who it excludes. For example, if I am related to somebody who is involved in politics in a small way, I'm prohibited from being on, not because of anything I did. What do you do with ex-spouses? Are ex-spouses excluded? What about people who have been involved and supportive of campaigns but have never given enough money? Are they too partisan to be involved? This amendment attempts to draw a line in a way that is very difficult to be fair about it, and it leaves us in a situation where lots of people get in who shouldn't, and lots of people who should be there can't. In fact, it does it even worse. It put judges in the position of having to decide how partisan you are. The judges are the ones who have to decide if you are allowed to be on the commission or not. What are they going to do? Investigate your background and figure out, well, they've been involved in leadership efforts for candidates. Are we going to do background checks? In fact, judges are supposed to be above politics, but we're asking them to get in the nitty-gritty of politics and figure out who can be too partisan and who can be sufficiently bipartisan. And when we do that, we're all the losers.
Now, I want to turn my next question to you folks here, the vote no side. You have as your tagline, your right to vote is being threatened. That's more than a little extreme, isn't it?
I'd say not at all. Sorry. First of all, today the legislature decides what congressional districts look like. You vote for your legislator. Secondly, we've seen it a lot in the last few years. If you don't like an act of the legislature, you can referendum it. That is the citizens' rights to challenge any decision, any vote, any bill passed by the legislature. That didn't happen here, but if citizens feel that a redistricting law is unfair, they can take it to the ballot. That was one of the major reforms 100 years ago that changed us from the Constitution of the past to the Constitution of the present, letting citizens have a role. This talks about citizens being involved, but it takes away the citizens' right. They don't elect people. They don't have the right to weigh in on anything that the commission does. And furthermore, millions of them are excluded from participating at all.
All right, I want to give you about a minute to respond.
Yeah, I'll take this one. The notion that citizens are somehow involved in the redistricting process as it now exists is utterly laughable. The process, and believe me, I'm not faulting the Republican Party because, frankly, if the Democrats had control, they'd have done the same thing. But the process now is a backroom process with no transparency and no accountability. Look, I spent 4 years in Congress. In the last 2 years of my time in Congress, I knew redistricting was coming, and like every other member of Congress, was doing everything I could do to position myself to preserve my own hide. That's what the system propagates now. Look, and these people are my friends, and I think very highly of many of them. But the truth is, these lines are taking citizens' voting rights away because they're perverting the process of democracy, and the very people who are propagating this are doing so in order to endure and continue with a process that's not serving the American people.
So I want to come back over here to the vote yes side here. The Plain Dealer writes in its editorial about issue 2, that the devil is in the details and this amendment could invite lawsuits. The Dispatch says the plan is open to manipulation by whichever party is the cleverest. Can you explain briefly how you've protected the system from being manipulated by lawsuits and by savvy partisans?
Okay, well, I would like to start out by saying, and I think we all know this, you can sue over anything. I mean, the whole notion of worrying about lawsuits, we know that one of the things that is very contentious is redistricting, and we need to expect that there are going to be lawsuits related to redistricting, and anything that is this intense is going to have some problems. Now, as we think about what we did to create what would be fair, and so that we would think about it being constitutional, which is kind of what you're getting at, you know, one of the things that we said is, okay, we want to make sure that Ohio is represented. So we have the 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 4 independents on the Citizens Commission, and that they work together in the light of day. And so we have very good transparency. And one of the things that does mitigate lawsuits is everybody kind of understands what actually happens with the process. So they can actually see what goes on. The thing that I think is also really cool is anyone in this room could actually apply to be on this commission. Anybody in this room, if you wanted to, you could actually create a map. You could actually submit a map. And then the framework that is provided is that you need to focus on compactness, competitive districts, and when you think about what that means, it also means keeping our communities together. And when you think about what that means in terms of kind of challenges, it's really hard to challenge when it comes to keeping, you know, really specific guidelines. Right now, we have the wild, wild west, and all you have to do is look at the map to know that there are no rules. I'll leave it at that.
All right, you have about a minute 40 to respond.
Sure. Well, one of the flaws that a lot of the groups I mentioned earlier and newspapers, that one of the reasons that a lot of groups oppose this is because of this idea of the potential for lawsuits, two of which we could think of right off the bat. The United States Constitution says legislative districts for our congressional delegation need to be drawn by our state legislature. So right there off the bat, we have a possible conflict with our United States Constitution, and we could be ruled unconstitutional. Second of all, it violates First Amendment rights in the discriminatory rules about who can and cannot serve on the commission. So these are major issues that will bring lawsuits, and why anybody would want to put in place, lock into our Constitution an amendment that invites so many lawsuits and so many questions is beyond me. And I would also note that a Pulitzer Prize-winning organization called ProPublica, and you can look that up on Google or ask us for the article later, looked very deeply into the California experiment with a citizens commission, and they uncovered how the Democrats gamed the system and uncovered all kinds of schemes where people manipulated the citizen commissioners. They put forth people to testify that were really representing interests of the Democratic Party, but they put themselves out as interested citizens or community activists. And so we have precedent to go on, we have experience to go on in California that shows that the system can be gamed, and very seriously so.
I want to pick up on that a little bit with my next question to the vote no side. The current map has been called the worst indulgence in gerrymandering in the state's history by the Canton Repository. And the supporters of Issue 2 have said the current system allows politicians to design their own districts, and it allows voters to pick the candidates and then the candidates to pick their voters. How is the map as it exists, the current map that was drawn by the legislature, how is it fair, 12-4, 12 Republicans, 4 Democrats, how is that fair in a state that's almost evenly divided in the last gubernatorial election and the last presidential election?
Well, the Canton Repository also urges a no vote, too, on the amendment. So, but certainly the map has raised questions, and it is something that can be debated. But Issue 2, remember, Issue 2 is offered up as the solution for how we improve the map-making process. It's offered up not just as a solution, but as a permanent solution, the last solution. It would get locked into our Ohio Constitution, and it says it's the better way to draw maps. But let's remember all the organizations and the newspapers that have seen the flaws contained in this and say there is a better way. And a lot of the couple of our newspapers and other folks have pointed to the Constitutional Modernization Commission as the place to address a better map-making process.
All right, you've got about 45 seconds to answer that.
It's not fair. It's not fair that Ohio has 16 seats, will have 16, and 12 may very well be Republican, 4 Democrats, certainly not representative of the demographic makeup or political makeup in the state of Ohio. The legislature, and I've heard both of my friends advocate that there is a better way, but the legislatures have time and time again had an opportunity to create that better way and have failed. And they've failed for the primary reason that the partisanism and the polarization that exists that Issue 2 is designed to remedy prevents them from doing that. It's a self-propagating system, and the chain needs to be broken, and this amendment breaks that chain.
All right, let's stay with that for just a moment here, this idea of partisanship. And I'm wondering, when you said the issue, I've heard Catherine and others say that the issue was in the planning stages for years, that this was something that you had talked about for a long time. And this time, though, it's financed overwhelmingly by Democrats and labor groups. And that's where I think we're getting a lot of the opposition from the Republican Party and business groups. Why didn't you work to get buy-in from these other groups and make a proposal that everybody could agree on?
All right, so the League of Women Voters, Citizen Action, Common Cause, a whole bunch of people have been working for many, many years on redistricting reform. We reached out, over a long period of time. In 2009, I don't know if you all remember our redistricting competition that we did then. This was the brainchild of Joan Lawrence, former Republican representative from Pataskala, and she was also the head of the Department of Aging and a member of the League of Women Voters since 1957. The thing that the thing that I'd like to highlight about that is that, you know, we did this competition because we thought, hey, we can show a better way. We can show that citizens can participate more fully. And then we did it again in 2011. And we did lots of outreach to different groups to try to get buy-in. Now, we are talking about a winner-take-all system. And the biggest problem is that the winners really like the system. They like it the way that it is. And, you know, we did outreach to all sorts of folks. You know, I wanted to throw this quote at you because I thought it was important. This is December 17th, 2008. I bet you remember this. This is.
I was out. Already out.
All right. Well, basically what was going on is my friend over there, Senator Jacobson, was on his way out. He was basically doing his farewell thing. And this is what he said. He said, "Redistricting is the most fun anyone could ever have in politics without going to prison." So, so you know, and if you want to catch that, if you all want to catch that, it's on the Ohio channel. I'm plugging you now.
Oh,
Right?
that's good.
So I guess what I really want to highlight is just how truly egregious the system is, and how issue 2 is really about changing and transforming this.
All right, you have about 2 minutes.
Thank you. Let me start out by saying I agree with a lot of what you said. You are right. The problem is winner take all. The thing that I can't understand in reviewing your issue is you took the California plan, which was name voters first, which passed in California before yours was proposed, and you took out the part that required bipartisan support. In California, you have to get a majority of the Republicans, a majority of the Democrats, and a majority of the independents to pass any plan. No matter what you do, you cannot have a plan where one side gets to win or take all. It wasn't like this just didn't get included. You actually took it out. It was there in their plan, and you took it out. That's the problem. It is very hard for those of us on the other side to sit here and say this was an attempt to be bipartisan or to make sure that we didn't have winner take all when you made sure when you drafted it that that was still there. And when you look at other things in the amendment, such as the fact that you didn't require a conflict of interest policy so that you could have employees who had a stake in the outcome, so that you could have employees who were every bit as partisan. It's really hard to see that there was an effort made to make sure it came out in a nonpartisan or bipartisan way. There's an effort to make sure it comes out different, but it could be different and just as partisan. So when we looked at this, we said, why didn't you start where everyone who has worked on this has started? You had a bipartisan group, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, leading senators, leading representatives who came together and proposed a plan that started with both sides must agree. You had the Secretary of State, John Husted, when he was a senator, lead the Senate in approving a proposal that said both sides must agree. You had the House talking about it and acting as if they wanted to pass it. And at the last minute, the Democratic leadership decided not to do it. You had every bit of bipartisanship to start with had you chosen to go that way. But for whatever reason, you weren't interested in bipartisanship. Instead, you went toward a potential partisan slam dunk that you say is not what you want.
All right, I want to pick up on that whole partisanship issue here for a moment. The current map, and I want to deal primarily with the congressional map, is designed to favor Republicans 12-4. The districts aren't very competitive here, so it's likely that Ohioans will once again see contentious primaries. They'll bring out more extreme candidates and more extreme voters as well. And these districts, because they're not competitive, whoever wins the primary will probably win the general election in many cases. And that will, in the words of the plain dealer, which also is on your side on this, said it will feed the partisan rancor in Washington and Columbus. So how does keeping the map and keeping the system as it is, because that's all we're voting on here is whether the system will change or stay as it is, how does that deal with gridlock and partisanship and all these things that people are saying they don't want anymore?
First of all, as my mom taught me, two wrongs don't make a right. And just because we have a map that some people believe need to be fixed and we agree there are issues that need to be improved doesn't mean that this is the way to do it, especially when it goes into the Constitution and is very difficult to change after that. You can fix a problem by making it worse. We've seen that in Washington more times than I care to mention. But the fact is, the issue here is that we have a partisan electorate in this nation. Democrats are more liberal than they were, Republicans are more conservative. No matter whether the districts are close or very far apart, the fact is you're going to nominate partisans. Look at what happened in Delaware. In Delaware, we had a moderate Republican congressman who was a shoo-in for the Senate 2 years ago. And he lost in the primary to a conservative who was a self-described witch. But that's who the Republicans chose because she was more partisan. By the way, that wasn't a district, that was the entire state. So you don't need a district to make that more partisan. You see that on the left side as well. Look at what happened to Joe Lieberman. Joe Lieberman, a shoo-in to be reelected as senator, was defeated by a fringe leftist in his own party's primary. We know how strong he was because he ran again as an independent. So you don't have to look at districts and say, that's why we have more liberal Democrats and more conservative Republicans. The bigger problem, as I see it, is that when you draw districts that are supposed to be evenly partisan to one side or another, as this amendment says you're going to do, that's not how votes turn out. In 2006, we didn't have an even electorate in Ohio. 2008, we didn't have an even electorate. 2010, we didn't. In the first two, it was heavily Democratic. In the third one, it was heavily Republican. So the first two times that this amendment had been there, you would have elected 60 Democrats. And then you would have turned around in 2010 and elected 60 Republicans. You think term limits are bad? Imagine if people could only have 2 years before they're thrown out. And imagine, once again, if nothing you do matters. If there's a partisan sweep going on, it doesn't matter if you were bipartisan. It didn't matter if you voted against your party. All that matters is you're in the wrong side, you're going down. And if that's the way that we're looking at, then we have a parliamentary system. We don't have a system where people get represented. And finally, when you do that, when you try to make these districts even, what you end up doing is taking a little chunk of big city, a little chunk of suburbs, and a little chunk of rural areas because you're trying to balance it out party-wise. Well, there's a problem with that. Who do you represent? How can you say you represent the rural Republican when you also have to represent the big city Democrats? So you end up representing just your party because you know in the end, that's what matters. That's wrong. That's further wrong. It moves us in the wrong direction.
I want to give you about 2 minutes and 45 seconds if you'd like to address all that.
Thank you. You know, I respect Jeff. He's a smart guy, but I really take issue with his premise that we've become polarized as a nation in our ideology. I think what's happening is that the ideological middle or center in this country is chronically underrepresented as a result of the structure that we have in place. And as a result, that moderate voice of the middle, those who find themselves somewhere near the middle on both sides, is being ignored as we find ourselves debating some of the most profound issues in generations. I mean, think about some of these issues that we have to deal with. We're seeing a shifting balance of power to the east. We've got the specter of climate change. We've got the specter of terrorism. We've got an economy that we need to fix. And we can't even agree on the simplest of things because of the rampant partisanism that exists in Washington, D.C., and it is a direct result of the way we draw these districts up. Now, I get these arguments about the appellate courts being involved in this and about the selection process and the other arguments that are being made on behalf of those who are against issue 2. And frankly, some of them make some sense. But the problem is you're not going to find any language that suits everyone. This thing is complex. It's long. It's almost laughably long when you hear it in this context, but it's long for a reason.
It's 7 pages.
It's got to be structured and tiered. Those layers are in place to preserve this nonpartisan perspective. If we're going to be able to deal with the issues that we have in front of us as a country, and they are significant, we need to fix this broken democracy. This is one way for us to do it. So like everything else, it's a cost-benefit analysis. Is the amendment perfect? Of course it's not. But we cannot allow ourselves to continue down this path. I don't know how much longer this country can sustain the stagnation and dysfunctionality that exists in Washington today.
You have about 45 seconds if you want to add on there,
Oh,
Catherine.
you know, one of the things that I thought was at the very end, when Jeff Jacobson said, yes, it's going to be very hard taking that center from the cities, the Democratic area out to the rural areas and where the rural Republicans. Well, that's what we have now. All you have to do is look at Franklin County and look at, you know, the district that Steve Stivers is in, basically works its way from his Upper Arlington house and kind of around in a section of downtown, and then it works its way all the way down to Athens. You know, that's what we have right now. And I'd also like to highlight, and it's not completely on topic, but on what your question was, but I would like to highlight this. We looked at all sorts of different reform measures, including the California one, but I want to be really clear. We did not base this on the California model, and what we did really focus on was not having sweetheart deals.
Okay. All right, before we turn it over to audience questions, which we're going to right after this question, I have one more question for this side specifically, and of course you'll get a chance to respond as well. There were lots of stories about how the current map was crafted at the order of certain people with input from certain people, specifically, say, U.S. House Speaker John Boehner, how it was changed at the request of one lawmaker to put a little peninsula in up in Northeast Ohio. So if the map was good for Republicans in Ohio, and there were all these backroom deals and private negotiations and that sort of thing that were happening in the process, how is the map good for voters? How is the process good for voters?
Well, I mean, we have to remember what we're voting on here. On November 6th or in early voting is issue 2. And does issue 2 address any of that or fix any of that? And it doesn't. And that's what we have to come back to. And remember that it doesn't require a bipartisan vote to get to agreement on what the map should be. It's full of other flaws, including how it discriminates against thousands of people who can't serve on the commission, how the commission itself is not accountable to voters or to our elected officials. And so that is really what we're deciding today. And what we have to stay on focus is issue 2. I don't know, Jeff, if you can add to that.
Well, I think the one thing that we have not really discussed is that constitutional scholars believe we can't touch the congressional map in any case. The U.S. Constitution requires that districting be done by the state legislature, or as it's been interpreted by Supreme Court decisions, its designee. This doesn't do that. This is the voters trying to, if this passes, create a commission. That has never been allowed to do the congressional races. And in fact, you know, there's a very good chance that this will not apply at all to congressional races. Although I do wish to point out as well that, you know, there was bipartisanship with regard to the congressional map. It created a district in Columbus for the first time, giving the city of Columbus a district of its own at the behest of those members of the Democratic Party from this area who were supportive of that concept. And so if you talk about how Steve Stiver's district ended up, remember that that was done in a bipartisan manner.
All right, you've got about minute 45.
Well, actually, that was my point. That was done in a bipartisan manner. When you have Republicans, Democrats, and independents, you're not talking about a sweetheart deal. You're talking about a way that we actually are represented. Many of us in the room, we're not Democrats, we're not Republicans, we are independents. And the other thing to think about is the light of day and accountability and how that really transforms everything.
You have another minute.
Oh, I have a whole nother minute.
I'll use it if you don't.
No, well, it's so funny. I'm a good talker, and I always worry that I've gone too long. The thing that I would really like to highlight as we kind of look at issue 2, and I appreciate that Jenny said, hey, what we need to go back to is issue 2. But we cannot forget what we go through and what is the actual process right now, and how truly unaccountable that process was. You know, we know from public records that they called the room that they actually did this in the bunker. And we know, how do you feel about, think about this, how do you feel about the public if you call the room that you draw the map in the bunker? Right, I mean, how do you feel about the public? The next thing I'd like to highlight, as we think about how bad the situation is, we think about what Zack's been getting at, which is good functional government, and then you start to think, well, hey, this is something that is such an improvement because of a group working together, the Independent Citizens Commission, transparency, and then finally, that all of us could be directly involved by creating maps. And now it's time to shut up. Sorry.
Well, now it's time
Karen.
to turn it over to audience questions here. As promised, we're now going to take some questions from the audience. CMC records all of its forums for broadcast on YouTube, streaming on CMC's website, and at the Columbus Metropolitan Library website. And while you're asking your question, please introduce yourself, and we thank you in advance for not making long editorial comments, which now that we've actually had the questions written out, perhaps we can avoid that. So go right ahead with your first question.
Thank you. Jim Garland, the Jeffrey Company. If issue 2 fails, What's the impetus for reform? Where will reform come from?
I'm going to start over here with the vote no side.
Well, sure. There are two mechanisms in place right now that are addressing redistricting reform. And one I mentioned earlier is the Constitutional Modernization Commission, which has just recently been members named to that, and that has been charged with looking at our Constitution from top to bottom. Several of the newspapers that have editorialized against Issue 2 have mentioned that and have asked that redistricting actually be a priority for that commission to look at. There's also the Ohio Redistricting Reform Task Force that was put in place late last year. That's a bipartisan task force that has been asked to provide ideas for how to improve redistricting in Ohio. I would add, too, I think, you know, what we gain maybe from Issue 2 and going through this exercise is that League of Women Voters and supporters have probably put more energy and more urgency into those very efforts to address redistricting.
I would also, if I could, add that, you know, the legislators who did this in a bipartisan way have not been discouraged. They're redoubling their efforts. In addition, it was very clear from the editorials that the people who said they are against it, you know, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Columbus Dispatch, the Akron Beacon Journal, and others said, you better not lose this opportunity. We agree this is the wrong way, so the ball is in your court to make it happen. And I think that message needs to be heard and is being heard. So there's a lot we can learn from this process, what not to do, and there's a lot of agreement on what needs to be done. And so I think you're going to see efforts take place in the next General Assembly after this is defeated, hopefully.
And you got about a minute and a half if you want to weigh in on that.
So what I'd like to highlight is I started working on redistricting reform in the late 90s, but I did this editorial board just recently with Joan Lawrence, who's been working on redistricting reform for 40 years. And you know, this is the criticism. Every single time you get to the point where you actually might pass something, every single time that we might actually have an opportunity to change the system, we want reform, we want a better system, we want it to be fair, but we just don't like this one. And that was a criticism in the 80s, and at that point the Democrats were advocating and the Republicans were against it, and here we have the flip and the same argument. The other thing is, you know, when I think about this Constitutional Modernization Commission that was supposed to have gotten off the ground in February, finally got appointed in September, you know, this is the kind of thing where I hope that they would get something done and get some other things done. But when you think about this, it's very hard to study away a problem. This is a true opportunity to actually change the system, and I know you wanted to say something.
Well, I just
Real quick.
Look, I'm afraid I'm very skeptical of the ability of the legislature and this system to rectify this problem on its own if we don't get this passed.
You have another question from the audience?
Hi, I'm Marie Trudeau. I'm with W.E. Davis Insurance. I feel like I won the lottery. And thank you all for being here. It's a very intellectual or intelligent debate, which is what CMC is all about. My question is, why not take the human and emotional factor out? Develop a computer program that uses census information to divide the districts based on geography and population density.
Go right ahead. I'll let you answer.
Okay, so her question about, hey, let's just let the computers do it, makes some good sense until you start thinking about majority-minority districts, until you start thinking about, how communities live and what it would mean to actually just hand it over to do it by the numbers. Now, there is I have to say, a real appeal to just doing it by the numbers. What we suggested is that we focus on goals, which is the goal of compactness, the goal of competitiveness, the goal of keeping your community together. And I think those goals are so important, and they would give some real proper guidelines to that commission and to the maps. We were very concerned about just do it by the numbers, mostly because of the majority-minority districts.
All right, you have about 45 seconds.
Yeah, we have to decide what's the most important principle in redistricting. Is it making the party balance exactly even, as this amendment would propose? Is that what people think about in their daily lives? Or is it more important to represent communities of people with like issues? For example, are the people who live in rural communities just Republican? Is that all that matters about them? Or do they have different problems from those in cities? And that's what happens with redistricting. You have that stark choice. Do you care about the partisanship as this amendment proposes? Or do you say instead, we need someone who's going to look at the price of corn as a problem of how I make a living if you represent the rural areas, or as a problem of how do I make ends meet for my family if you represent a suburban or a city? We can't look at this in a partisan lens, and yet that's what this amendment does, and that's unfortunate.
All right, let's go back for another audience question.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Grant. I find it disturbing that out-of-state PACs without transparency can control Ohio's redistricting by donating anonymously to state legislative district campaigns. Doesn't that somewhat take away the average Ohio voter's rights?
I'm going to let the vote no side to start on that one.
I mean, that's true of any system that you come up with. Under our federal laws, under the Supreme Court decision, people can get involved and make their voices known in any election. Issue 2, ironically, if passes, will make that worse because you won't have the ability to be in your district and build up rapport with the people in your community because you represent them or do something to advocate their rights. You're going to be at the mercy of the trend of every election, and the trend of every election can be exacerbated by heavy spending. You know, one of the things that we really like about our system is when you get people who can be independent and get to the point where they have support in their district that crosses party lines. Issue 2 will prevent that from happening by never giving anybody the chance to survive the partisan trend of a particular election year.
Got about 50 seconds.
I think you can tell a lot about an issue by looking at where the money comes, either in support or opposition to it. And I think we're going to see a lot of money spent on issue 2. We already have, and we will over the next couple of weeks. Certainly would urge everyone to take a close look at where this money's coming from. But that begs the larger question about the need for comprehensive campaign finance reform. If there is a more compelling need than that for redistricting, it may well be that, but unfortunately, that's the subject perhaps of another day.
Go back to the audience for another question.
Good afternoon. My name is Noah Williams, and I'm the president for the Columbus NAACP. My question is, how will the proposed commission or committee ensure diversity in the selection process?
I'll go ahead and have you answer that first.
All right, so one of the things that we really wanted to make sure is that diversity was part of this commission as well. And not just, you know, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, you've heard me say that before. We basically go through a process where, and I want to highlight this, if you think about who you would want to do a screening of the potential commissions, you know, the judicial branch makes the best sense. And what the appeals court judges do is that it's not like, hey, they go and they appoint them. They go through a process where they review them and say, they select 42, and then we go through a process, where we winnow down through a series of kind of lots. And what she's getting at the very end has to do with diversity. So when you do that lot, you draw them out by 9, you pull 9 out of the hat. Those 9 then say, oh, wait a second, who's actually missing? Who's not here in the commission? And so that kind of diversity would, of course, address African American diversity. It would also address, well, wait a second, there's nobody actually from Columbus. And so as we think about the diversity on the commission, that's one of the ways that it is represented. Also, we ask they do the screening process and they look at the applicants, that they look for diversity in that pool at the very beginning.
You have about 1:20 if you want to
Sure.
weigh in.
We know the amendment mentions that diversity is important, but it doesn't expressly give details as to how to achieve that. And it doesn't expressly give details as to how to achieve balance between urban and rural districts and minority communities. And so that's a concern, and I would encourage you to read the amendment and see how it lacks details around that. There's a passage about diversity, but there's no details about it, really.
Just to add one other thing, I got involved in caring about this process in 1981, and I saw the census that we had then and the way the districting was done. You ended up in a situation where the African American community throughout the state was broken up in districts for the legislature into small pieces to elect basically as few African Americans as they had to, and the rest were put in with a bunch of suburban areas to drive districts to be Democratic. They didn't elect minority representation, they elected Democrats who were Caucasian. I thought that was wrong. I felt that we needed to change that. And in 1991, when the control changed, that was one of the things that got accomplished. Dayton elected, for example, an African-American legislator, 2 at one time for the first time in history. They elected an African-American senator. They expanded the numbers in Cleveland and in other areas around the state. And we did that because that was how you kept communities of interest making their own decisions for the future. And that's not in this amendment at all. It's unfortunate that we are turning back the clock in that way.
All right, we have time for one more audience question, and then we're going to have 1 minute of closing statements from both sides. So go right ahead, sir.
Thank you, Karen. My name is Mike Curtin, and in spirit of full disclosure, I am a Democratic candidate this year for the Ohio House. One may detect...
and also a supporter of Issue 2, as I recall.
And I am a supporter of Issue 2. Thank you, Karen. My two-part question is this. Since 1851, the Ohio Constitution has required that state legislative districts be compact. The word compact has been a constitutional requirement since 1851. How have we been able to get away with drawing districts that are not compact in direct violation of the Ohio Constitution since 1851? And my second question, that two-part question, is there a state in the nation with a more severely gerrymandered map than Ohio's new map?
I'm going to let the vote no side go ahead and take those.
Well, first of all, Ohio's Constitution requires a lot of things. It requires you to start from the previous decade's map and to make only those changes that are necessary. It then has a series of rules of how you how you split counties, which limits severely your ability to make things compact. For example, if a county has is capable of having more than one representative in it, you can't have more, you have to have the correct number of full representatives, and then all the rest has to be in just one district. When you start playing with this logical nested series of requirements, the maps don't turn out perfectly compact. The second thing is, yes, I'll give you one that is more severely, I can give you more, but I'll start with one that is more severely gerrymandered, if you call it, than Ohio's. California, under the Voters' First Amendment. It's been widely criticized for the process and the outcome, which took a plan that was gerrymandered to begin with 10 years ago. Unlike previous California maps that had been pretty sedate matters agreed to pretty much across the board, 10 years ago was a partisan redistricting job, and this one made it even more democratic than what it was before, after promising that it wouldn't happen. It came about in part because of the way the process was manipulated, where people would come forward and not disclose the fact that they were employed by one elected official or another, and they'd set up a group that testified and said, our neighborhood needs specific representation, without disclosing that that was because it would benefit a certain congressman if a map was drawn to keep that community together or to do what they wanted. ProPublica has all of it in detail. This is not a conservative organization. It's funded by people on the left, and it exposed the travesty that the California Redistricting Commission became.
Got just about 2 minutes.
The process as it exists now, and as it has existed for decades, has a single source, a sole motive. There's only one force behind it, and that is to protect incumbents. That's the bottom line. And those states that have a Republican majority protect Republican incumbents, and those that have Democratic majorities protect Democratic incumbents. And when that happens, you see things like Ohio's 18th Congressional District, for example, the one that I used to represent, runs from Carrollton up in the northeastern Ohio to Chillicothe in southwestern Ohio. It's absurd. Beyond the compactness issue, however, it represents what I believe to be a serious perversion of the democratic process, and accounts for more than, perhaps with one exception, campaign finance rules, the reason for the inability of this country to tackle the problems that we have ahead of us. Now, arguing that there are other states that are more gerrymandered than ours doesn't, in my opinion, justify the no position on this issue. It supports it. This is not a problem unique to the state of Ohio. It's a problem that this country is facing. Ohio has an opportunity to take a lead on this issue, to show the rest of the nation that we're not the state that we're made out to be when you turn on the news every night. It's as though we're the center and the core of divisiveness now in this country, this cancer that has hit our political process. We are now the poster boy for it. This is an opportunity for us to take a stand and do the right thing. Again, it's not perfect. but do a cost-benefit analysis. We have to do something, and that something is issue 2.
All right, we have time for closing arguments, 1 minute each, and you started first. We'll have you start first again, and you'll be after them.
So one of the things that I would like to highlight as we think about an independent citizens commission is somebody that, you all already figured out I like quotes. And there was a president named Ronald Reagan that was very fond of talking about redistricting. This is one of the things that he really highlighted as being really important. He talked about, maybe it's time to actually consider a citizens blue ribbon commission. And I want to highlight that citizens commissions have been done not just in California, but in Arizona and some other states, including New Jersey. I just want to highlight that this is a way that we can actually take the drawing, take the pen out of the hands of elected officials who have such a conflict and actually turn it over to voters to act in the best interest of all of us, to focus on compactness and competitiveness and keeping communities together. And I'm going to close with this, and it's from Ronald Reagan, who said, and that's all we ask for, an end to the anti-democratic and un-American practice of gerrymandering congressional districts.
All right.
Vote yes on issue 2, please.
You have a little over a minute.
We have several reasons why you should vote no on issue 2. Our proponents have said themselves the plan is imperfect. After the ballot board exercise, they even said it was confusing. Remember, issue 2, if approved, permanently locks into our state constitution this seriously flawed system. It would be almost impossible to change or repeal except at great expense to the taxpayers. It creates a 12-member commission that's not accountable to Ohioans or to their elected representatives. It discriminates against thousands of Ohioans who say, and it says they can't apply to the commission because of their work history, because of who they're related to, because of their past voting record, and if they've been at all politically active. It says people, not politicians, but in fact thousands of politicians at the local level they can serve. Local politicians at the city, the county, township, villages, school boards, and their families, they are eligible. Issue 2 doesn't give serious guidance on expenditures. It says the commission itself will set its own salaries, determine its own budget, and that the General Assembly must provide what's necessary.
That's a minute.
All right.
All right. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it. And thank you all for the questions in the audience.
And on behalf of CMC, thank you all again. This is an issue that has been woefully under-discussed in public forums, and I'm so glad that we had such a thorough and competent discussion today. Hope you enjoyed the forum today. In fact, you can see it again on YouTube. There's a CMC website connection to that. Next week's forum, school to prison pipeline. Sign up for it. It's going to be an interesting discussion as well. Once more, let's thank the Jeffrey Company, the Ohio Farm Bureau, Hannah News Service, and thank you to our speakers, Catherine Turcer, Zack, Jenny Camper, Jeff Jacobson, and Karen Kassler, our moderator. Thank you all.